And we are live streaming and recording. So whenever you're ready, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Clerk. I hope everybody had a great and blessed Thanksgiving. I don't know.
I think we just lost him. He'll be back on in a moment.
That's the good Thanksgiving.
Jennifer, does the mayor know that we've lost him?
Yes, he's signing him back on now.
I think I'm back.
Yep.
Sorry about that. I think I clicked where I shouldn't have, but let me call this workshop meeting to order. I hope everybody had a nice Thanksgiving. And boy, I'm going to turn this thing right over to a combination, I think, of Dale Morris to kick us off and Matt Fountain to have a presentation. I want to welcome our guests. I see Josh here with us, and there are some others who are going to join us that have been a part of the deliberations for this. You know, we started some discussion about this additional measure to help protect folks from flooding. And at the time, you know, I think there were a lot of situations where the use of fill in construction is needed, depending on site conditions and all like that. So we really had to come back and take a deeper dive and involve our partners, and that's exactly what we've done over the last few months. So with that short intro, Dale, you want to kick us off? Take it away.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Happy belated Thanksgiving to all of you that I didn't say happy Thanksgiving before. And thanks for joining us today. Matt and I are going to run through some quick slides for you. As the mayor mentioned, this issue on fill for construction sites has been around for quite some time. We spent a lot of time focusing on this in Dutch dialogues, but really the issue predates us or predates what we did in the Dutch dialogues. It just came sort of to a head then. And City Council, as you know, has addressed the issue a couple times, in some ways unsuccessfully. So we decided we would try again to see if we could do something with a bunch of stakeholders. So that's what we're here to discuss today. And we do not have an draft ordinance prepared for you. We wanted to work through this workshop with you all, get your comments and feedback and get your directions. And if you also deem, we will work with legal to get an ordinance to you quickly so you can consider that under normal processes. Next slide, please, Matt. Matt's driving the train here, so I'm just following his direction. So again, we'll give you some background on where we are, the process to date, what considerations and goals. As noted before, when I started last year, some members of City Council asked me to pull this issue along where I could to help Matt and his team and others to pull this issue along. That occurred again this year, earlier in the spring. Really, Councilman Appel said, "Hey, Dale, and hey, Matt, would you guys see what you can do?" And so we've done that over the summer. Matt's going to talk about our recommendations and considerations and how to apply the regulations, how to regulate, and then again, get your feedback. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, you know, these issues were very clearly addressed or a focus of attention during the Dutch dialogues. We had a number of key recommendations, and as you know, City Council adopted these recommendations in 2019. But again, in our overall strategies, you know, in flood zones, marshy or tidal or otherwise low-lying areas, eliminate or substantially reduce the placement of fill or others to structures that decrease infiltration, absorption, performance of these areas. And again, in the Church Creek chapter, we specifically said, you know, eliminate or substantially reduce the placement of fill or other structures that, you know, impair the performance of the floodplain or the general area. And one other thing I wanted to highlight is the Dutch Dialogues team clearly relies upon, we have seen the benefit of innovation and leadership from nonprofit sectors, environmental groups, but also industry and the private sector. And often those groups are left out towards the end in these processes. And we were very clear, we think the private sector should be engaged from the beginning to get the benefit of their input. And also the private sector is really going to be the ones who innovate here in response to our policy goals. So we need them, and we're thankful that they were part of this process over the last number of years. And the next slide, please, Matt. And so again, City Council addressed this issue when I was with the Water Institute. I got repeated calls from journalists and folks from city staff members asking, what did we mean? Did we mean ban fill completely everywhere, every place across the city? And that was not something we meant, but those were questions coming at us. We sort of addressed a lot of our issues in Church Creek related to what was called the low elevation zone. And the problem with the low elevation zone in the Dutch Dialogues recommendations is, those were not regulatory zones and they were not mapped. And so to move forward that process, it triggered a whole bunch of regulatory complexity, or would create regulatory complexity going forward. Very importantly, the Stormwater Design Standards Manual with Matt and his team, as they moved that forward and got it adopted with City Council, it does address the quantity fill within certain development sites and certain parts of the floodplain, but it is not complete as we looked at this from the Dutch Dialogues perspective. So it's a great start. It's very important, but we think it should be built upon and strengthened. And so again, in 2020, 2021, Matt and his team, he pulled together a number of folks, key stakeholders to increase the regulation of fill. And I was asked to help pull that along since I started. This spring, we convened a stormwater working group here in City Hall. We had consulted with a number of city departments, stormwater, affordable housing, planning, preservation, sustainability, resilience, and sustainability, public services, and legal. So almost the entire part of the city staff were involved here. But importantly, we involved a number of key outside stakeholders. So industry, the Home Builders Association, and the Realtors Association. We engaged with the environmental groups, the Coastal Conservation League of South Carolina, and the Southern Environmental Law Center, and the Historic Charleston Foundation, key stakeholder here in Charleston, and of course the Metro Chamber of Commerce, which is trying to make sure we have good workforce housing so our economy here can continue to develop, but also do this in a smart way that is sensible to future flood risk. And so that's what we've done. We have a number of key recommendations from the stakeholder work group, and Matt's going to go through them, and we will seek your advice and counsel and direction afterwards. Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Dale. So Dale's going to, I guess, lateral to me, and I will take a few more slides, stay with our football analogies. So these are always hard to present in a linear slide format when you're talking about sort of this big cloud of ideas and thoughts and processes we've had that we've worked over the last few years trying to kind of narrow down and squish down. But I'm going to make an attempt. So likely there'll be some backtracking, a little bit of adjustment, but we're going to start out with sort of, well, what are we trying to do to help restrict sort of the poor use of fill in areas where it basically worsens flooding. So we're going to look to complement requirements of our Stormwater Design Standards Manual. As Dale mentioned, we did implement the manual. It does do a lot to impact basically how fill is used to displace water onto adjoining properties in areas with heavy flooding. So we want whatever we do to kind of complement that and not work in opposition to it. We do want to improve flood protection of regulated developments. So we want the new development to not flood, but similar to what we did with the Design Standards Manual, it's equally important to not protect yourself by flooding your neighbor that's already there or has been there for decades or hundreds of years in Charleston. We do want to improve future adaptability. That's the kind of the core tenet of resiliency, right? Of that not only are we safe today, but we're safe in the future. We want clear objective requirements. That was something we heard very loudly from the stakeholder group, right? That whatever the requirement is, make it easy to understand what exactly will be required so it can go in early in a pro forma for any development considerations or any permitting considerations on our side for comments. From a city staff perspective, trying to use existing mechanisms of review. This is a way to keep the costs down of a bureaucratic process or administrative process to enforcing a mechanism is to basically already have it be something that we're looking at, where you're not creating a whole new piece of a technical review committee. You're not creating a whole new separate process. You're using existing processes at the city. What we looked at was still allowing for responsible development to continue as allowed in the current zoning code. So the intent of the fill ordinance is not to prevent development from occurring. It's to make sure that it's only occurring in a responsible way on parcels that are suited for it, that doesn't allow for basically harm to the flood resiliency of the area. We also wanted to focus on new construction. This is certainly the easiest, if anything is easy, but the easiest pathway to improving resilience is as you're building new items. So it's not going in and enforcing existing properties into compliance. It's only taking new properties as they're being constructed, new foundations in this case as they're being constructed, as we'll talk about. Then we're trying to avoid cost prohibitive requirements. Anything you regulate generally increases cost. But we don't want to do it away and again in a way that impacts affordability, especially. That was one of the groups we met with, spent a lot of time with, was the affordable housing group at the city to get input on how do we prevent driving up costs of housing to a point where it's not sustainable in the market. So one of the areas we talked about is sort of where do we apply these regulations, right? So we're talking about, in this case, again, adding regulations in to reduce the amount of fill, reduce flood risk. There were sort of three main options we were looking at. One was similar to what we did with the comprehensive plan, look at elevation-based approaches to say, well, we could look at basically the lowest elevation areas in the city. That's generally a smaller geographic area. It is typically a more heavily regulated process and one that the city is looking at with the comprehensive plan already. It's also, if you get into very low elevations, regulated by OCRM or the Corps of Engineers, depending on exactly what type of property it is. Our city stormwater manual is much more difficult in these very low lying sites because of some of the nature of that technical part of the manual. We can get into that in great detail if you wanted to. We looked at the 100-year floodplain. Obviously, that's a currently regulated mapped boundary within the city that everyone already has to account for in their development work. It builds off of the existing permitting processes at the city to make sure you're complying with floodplain requirements. It's certainly an area that's at the highest risk for tidal flooding in the city. Frequently in the way our protocol works, obviously that overlaps with rainfall flooding. So there's still quite a bit of overlap, though not a complete overlap. And then we looked at the 500-year floodplain that's also mapped by FEMA as the shaded X zone on flood maps. It is expected, as we get sea level rise and intensifying storms, that eventually shaded X may become 100-year floodplain someday in the future. So there is some benefit from a resiliency perspective to looking at that larger area, but we don't currently have the same level of enforcement mechanisms in a 500-year floodplain because it's not something that's regulated outside of the 100-year. So the recommendation from the group in this case was to focus on the 100-year floodplain. That was seen as sort of a good intermediary. It's not quite as aggressive as the 500-year floodplain, but it is more aggressive than only focusing on a few low-lying areas. It's built into the existing city processes, so there's no new process being created, no new staff being hired in order to do that, no secondary permitting process for development to go through. Jump to the next slide. And just to give a better sense of what that is, so here's a map of the entirety of the city, which makes it hard to see, but we'll have some zoom ins in a minute. The blue is basically anywhere within a 100-year floodplain. You'll see that much of that is marsh or almost riverfront in certain areas, or river. As you move away, the orange becomes the 500-year floodplain, and then the green is basically areas that are outside of any kind of mapped floodplain. So you'll see there is some area of the city certainly outside of any mapped floodplain where we get to our highest elevations. There's certainly a decent amount of developable area in the orange, but also quite a bit in the blue. So I got some zoom ins. It's hard to see. Here's a map again, zooming in where blue is in the 100-year, orange is in that 500-year, green is in the not mapped at all as floodplains. So just giving a sense of what area we're talking about regulating. So again, generally the low-lying areas, but not always. As you get closer to the water, you will have even slightly higher areas. I'll still have that storm surge. And then this is a series of maps that GIS put together, a little easier to see. This pulls the tidal area out, sort of the actual tidal marsh area out from the mapping. So here we're looking at the 100-year floodplain being kind of the fleshy pink color, for lack of a better term, and the areas outside of the 100-year floodplain being more of the pale coloration. So now you can start to see, without the marsh overlay, what we're talking about within the 100-year floodplain, in this case, just completely without. So we're regulating basically the areas within that kind of pinker, orangier flesh color. So here's what it would look like, obviously, Peninsula, Kanehoy area, moving down to James and Johns Island, areas for regulation, certainly significant amount of James Island, the low-lying areas of Johns Island, but not the higher-lying areas on the commercial corridors. And then finally, West Ashley, significant amount of the low-lying areas of West Ashley, though certainly not all of the higher-lying center areas. So kind of how or when, again, what we do within this 100-year floodplain, what we're recommending are basically focusing on single-family residential parcels. Those are typically the most vulnerable to flood impacts and the hardest to recover after flooding. Commercial properties can be flood-proofed and certainly carry a different risk. Commercial and institutional properties often have uses that require slab-on-grade foundations, which we're going to talk about if you're building a school, if you're building a warehouse. There are certain things you can't really do with an elevated foundation very easily. Single-family housing is much more flexible. So we're proposing for single-family detached. These are kind of standalone housing units. New foundations would not be allowed to be slab on grade or an elevated slab. The two pictures here are sort of showing what FEMA thinks of as a slab on grade versus an elevated slab. On the left, slab on grade is what we all think about, that your concrete slab is put basically right on the existing ground. You can fill to get to that quote unquote existing ground, but it's just existing ground. An elevated slab is basically where you build a little wall, vertical wall under your building, fill that with dirt, and then put your slab on top of that. So your slab is basically elevated, but the only fill that's allowed is directly beneath the slab. So the intent here is, or the recommendation, and there are certainly, these are all open for discussion, that nothing is final, but this is where the task force kind of came up with. For single family detached residential, again, standalone single family homes, no slab on grade nor raised slab. They basically have to be some kind of elevated foundation, whether it's a crawl space or a truly elevated home on piers or pilings. There's a number of different construction options for that. We're not trying to limit what the builders can do, but say you can't in terms of how you elevate, but you have to have some type of elevation. For single family attached, these are the townhomes generally. We're recommending no slab on grade housing, but it's still a consideration for a raised slab foundation. And there were a number of reasons for that we can get into if anyone would like to spend more detail, but there's some with the aesthetic, some with the potential for future elevation on a very large building like that is much more challenging to basically raise that elevation in the future. So a slab doesn't have quite the same negatives as it does on an individual single family home. And it does keep your cost of construction slightly lower, which also matters on what's generally a product, not always, but generally a product that kind of sits between apartments and detached single family housing. So the intent here was basically to remove an incentive for a builder to place fill, right? If you're in the 100-year floodplain, you likely have to somehow elevate your foundation to get it above the FEMA flood elevations plus the city's 2 foot of freeboard. Traditionally, that's been done by bringing in fill material anywhere that isn't very close to marsh, where you can get to a park under condition and you have a truly elevated home. But if you go back more than 30 years or so, these were all crawl space homes, as you see in a lot of West Ashley and James Island. And in a crawl space home, you can get water under your home, which is certainly inconvenient, and it can still cost you money, but it's not nearly the impact of having water in your home. So most of the structural flooding we see is still these slab on grade houses, because if there's any failure in the stormwater system, or if there's any storm bigger than the stormwater system is able to handle, because your slab is basically at the same elevation as everything around you, you have a much greater chance of that water entering the home than if your home is a couple of feet above everything around you. Charleston is so flat, right, that as that water starts to get higher, there are many more places it can go and spread out rather than into your home. The other advantage of not bringing in fill kind of on a regional basis is that, we, in our stormwater design standards manual, you're designing to have your site be effective in a 25-year storm. You're having it designed to not worsen flooding in a 100-year storm. But if you have a 500-year storm, you're still in excess of what we've designed for. So there is the potential in a storm that's that large, you would potentially push some of that water with enough fill onto a neighboring property and cause problems in that situation. So this is sort of a little bit of belts and suspenders, but again, it's trying to complement what the stormwater manual is already doing. We also, in our last manual update, put in what are called submerged stormwater systems, where basically you no longer have to put in fill to be able to get your pipes to have slope to them to meet the stormwater manual. They can be flat, similar to what is on a lot of Daniel Island, which was done as sort of a design exception at the time. But now that's actually a regulated process within the manual. So that's removed an incentive for fill. So now if you kind of remove the incentive to do slab on grade foundations, that removes another incentive for fill. And at some point, the fill just costs you money that you don't actually need. So you bring in much less fill. And that's something that, again, the stakeholder group was relatively supportive of this approach. The last bullet on there is sort of the when side of this. So here's how we would recommend implementing this, but when would you implement it? One of the other inputs from the group was to make sure there's a clear time frame for adoption, something on the order of 12 months. So that basically, again, developments that are already in process that didn't envision a different foundation material, a different design, can get through their construction period, but we're still capturing new product as it's being conceptualized and being brought into permitting. We did something very similar with the city stormwater manual, and we did that. Is the same kind of thing would happen where you had to have a vesting method to make sure that projects that were sort of already in the middle of construction didn't have to back up and come up with a different approach. So then kind of what happens then, one of the things we did want to put in was again, we did this with the stormwater manual. I think it was very successful, is 12 to 18 months after it's been adopted, gather the stakeholder group again back together and see how it's going, basically get some input on what problems that we didn't envision are happening, both for the regulation being more restrictive than we intended, but also less restrictive than we intended, and see how do you address any of those issues. Are there specific scenarios we hadn't looked at? And obviously, if there's a crisis type issue, we can always make an adjustment at any time, but this is more a chance to look at the overall process as building occurs, and then report back to the Public Works Utilities Committee with basically what the group is seeing and what we would recommend for the future. With that, I'm going to take a pause, and there's a lot of information to put at you at the same time, and let Dale kind of touch on this slide for us.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Great explanation of what the stakeholder group came up with. Appreciate that. The background and the technical complexity of doing this, but also trying to ensure some simplicity with the industry. It's pretty important. One or two comments from my side. I do think it's important to acknowledge that what you're seeing around the U.S. and a lot of places that are adopting the Atlas 14 NOAA rainfall guidance is the old 500-year regulatory floodplain is now becoming the 100-year. So the levels of risk are increasing. So your 1% chance of risk is now, in fact, increasing substantially. So the goal here is to look at the 100 and try to get some compliance there, and to see in the future if we need to go further. Again, that's something we will look at down the road. But again, with these changes with rainfall amounts and what you're seeing with sea level rise and the impact upon the floodplain, this is a good, important first step for resilience over the longer term. The city has to learn to adapt and is adapting, and this is a mechanism to achieve that. And also, this is this is individual and collective resilience. And the reason I say that is in a lot of floods in the Southeast between 2015 and 2021, what FEMA is seeing is that 30 to 40% of flood damages are occurring in structures beyond the 500-year floodplain, 30 to 40%. This is, evidence of this change where I just mentioned regarding the 500-year floodplain and the 100-year floodplain and water levels within them during flood events. So again, if we can move to this process, future homeowners are going to be able to come a little more resilient. Again, if you have water under your house, as Matt said, that's a problem. But 1 inch of water in your house, according to FEMA, is easily about $25,000 to $30,000. So again, this kind of change over time would be very important, I think, for the city to consider the benefits of. And with that, Mayor, Matt and I are done. I want to make you aware that we have representatives from the stakeholder group, or the task force, as Matt called it, to provide just a few comments if you would like that.
Absolutely.
Well, great. Then I will call on Josh Dix from the Realtors.
Josh, you want to go first?
Sure. And I'll, before I get into it, I take this opportunity to, for all the Carolina fans, I will give you 5 seconds to heckle me, and I'll take a public flogging, and then we'll get back to business. But
It's going to take more than 5 seconds, Josh. Sorry.
They're going to flog me next Tuesday, Josh. Don't worry.
all right. Well, fair enough. But I just wanted to put that out there. But first, I'd like to say thank you for including us on the front end. I think this was a really productive way to go about an ordinance, to where we're not having to pick it apart on the back end. So thank you for being proactive and including us on the beginning. I think the big parts to reemphasize that Dale and Matt touched on was just the general understanding that some fill material is necessary, but we do want to greatly reduce the amount that we're using on these sites. And from there, it's really about the maintenance in these developments that we need to get some support on. The best design system can be flawed because of maintenance issues. And after that, really, it's allowing for a transition. I think what Matt laid out, roughly a period for us to go from adoption to implementation, and then a transition for the projects that are nearing the pipeline. That's a big part of being able to do this successfully. So we would just ask for some grace there as we transition from one standard to another. And one of the things that we had discussed was, with the zoning work coming up, revisiting the height restrictions in some of these areas to allow for drive under parking spaces. It would be a way that we could reduce the amount of pervious surface on a lot. The homeowner would still get the same density, but it would just be something that we think would couple well with this 100-year ordinance. To be paired together would be helpful for us, just from a design point of view, and give direction on substantial renovations and additions. If there's a home that's currently on a slab and they want to do an addition, how do we navigate that? I think a little direction from council on how you vision that, and allow us the opportunity to see from a design development point of view, would that work? Those would be the things that we would ask for. But again, we appreciate the opportunity to be involved. I think this is a solution that we can work with, and Matt kind of alluded to it, but this is just a 1% regulation, but we have a lot of these 1% regulations that are making affordability a real issue for us. So just keep that in mind as we discuss these changes to the development standards. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have some for me.
All right, thank you, Josh.
Yes, sir.
Anyone else, Dale?
Yeah, Chris, you want to
Chris?
take it?
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Dale. Thanks, Matt, Josh, Mayor Tecklenburg, members of council. Thank you for the opportunity to provide some brief comments. My name is Chris DeShere, and I'm the South Carolina Office Director for the Southern Environmental Law Center here in town. And today I'm speaking on behalf of my organization, but also Historic Charleston Foundation and the Coastal Conservation League. And I just briefly want to say, in the last few years, this council has taken really important steps to address the increasing threat of flooding. Council has formally adopted the Dutch Dialogue's final report as guiding policy for the city, approved a new city stormwater design standards manual to better address future sea level rise and intensifying storms, adopted a new comprehensive plan rooted in living with water, and embarked on a citywide water plan, among other important steps. And so to build on that progress, our organizations have been working, as folks have mentioned, together in close collaboration with the Charleston Trident Association of Realtors, the Charleston Home Builders Association, and the Charleston Metro Chamber of Commerce, as well as the city's Office of Resilience, Stormwater Department, and Department of Planning, Preservation, and Sustainability, to identify potential policy approaches for encouraging more resilient and sustainable development within the city. And as Charleston continues to grow, it's critical that we do so in a resilient manner without overdeveloping vulnerable locations susceptible to flooding. However, even after the passage of the city's new stormwater design manual, we've continued to see some new development within the 100-year floodplain that uses fill material to meet the city's freeboard requirement in order to continue to construct houses with slab-on-grade foundations. And as folks have mentioned, due to the sensitive ecology and low elevation of the low country, the use of fill material to achieve freeboard requirements is not only inconsistent with the Dutch Dialogue's approach, but threatens to increase the risk of damage to adjacent properties, essentially pushing floodwater onto neighboring areas. And also, new homes built in the 100-year floodplain utilizing slab-on-grade foundations are very difficult, as people have already mentioned, to elevate and to adapt to increasing flooding threats. And the required re-engineering to elevate a slab-on-grade home is challenging and expensive, often resulting in unmanageable cost burdens for many families in Charleston. So it's for these reasons that our organizations have sought to work with Charleston city staff and other interested stakeholders to support the development of a policy that ensures that future development can be more adaptable. We therefore support the effort to prohibit the use of fill material to meet the city's freeboard requirements and to prohibit slab on grade in the floodplain. And we look forward to seeing the draft language in the coming weeks and supporting this effort through the ordinance process, and really appreciate everyone's time and for your commitment to finding sensible ways of making the city more resilient to flooding and the threats of climate change. And under the mayor's and city council's leadership and in collaboration with the stakeholders involved here, we hope that we can make progress not only on this specific issue, but also on other sensible policy improvements to ensure the resilience of the city going forward for all of its citizens. So thank y'all.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Chris.
Thanks, Mayor. Bailey Vincent is on from the Metro Chamber, and they were also a key partner in this.
Oh, Bailey.
Hey, I just want to thank everyone for including us in this process ahead of time. It's super helpful for us to be included on the front end of this stuff. And then really just want to echo a lot of Josh's comments, how important that time frame for adoption is for us. And then specifically having the 100-year floodplain instead of the 500-year floodplain as well.
Okay. Thank you, Bailey. So I think that wraps up kind of the presentation portion, and I'll open the floor up for council discussion or any questions you may have for any of the above. And if you like, I'll knock it off with a question. And one of the comments that Josh mentioned was the example of if you built a new home, a new addition on an existing home, how would that get handled? And Dale and Matt, I know you said this was for new construction. What happens in the scenario where someone, not from damage, but they're just intentionally renovating their structure and they know they're going to go over that 50% of the value of the property, and normally they would have to meet current codes. So under that scenario, are we counting that as new construction or not? I mean, I was just curious.
It's a good question. It's a good question, Mayor. So the intent of how we set this up was you would, in the discussion you're having about substantial improvement or substantial damage, this would only trigger if you were to demolish your existing foundation and build a new foundation.
I see.
So it would not occur if you did choose to take that, if you were going to do a renovation and tear your existing structure down and tear up the foundation and go back and put in a larger structure or a different structure, you would have to meet the foundation requirement, but basically anything on an existing foundation could be left in place. And that was trying to, again, meet the affordability challenges sometimes with that substantial improvement, substantial damage scenario.
Gotcha. Okay. I saw Councilmember Gregg and then Waring.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Bailey, you mentioned this 500-year versus 100-year. Could you please elaborate on that question real quick? Is she still on?
Yeah. I think for the chamber, I know initially in some of the earlier talks, they were talking about doing the 500-year floodplain.
Okay.
And then we came to the agreement that we would settle on the 100-year floodplain as the recommendation.
And the 100-year is our recommendation at this point, and then see how it goes before we step it up anymore.
Okay. So a couple quick questions. So District 1 is mostly, at least the Cainhoy Peninsula is mostly the VE, the A, the AE, and X zones. Most of the new construction out here is post and beam or perimeter block walls. So the way I'm reading this, this wouldn't really affect new construction out here if they continue with that. I mean, this really only applies to places where you've got slab on grade and you're filling in that area trying to get it up the 1 foot above the flood elevation, correct?
So you're correct. It only applies if you're trying to add fill to meet your basically slab on grade elevation for that 100-year floodplain. So it's in very low lying areas, you typically don't see it because they are going to elevate the home and do a park under or drive under situation. In very high areas, you don't generally see it because you're outside the 100-year floodplain and you wouldn't have to meet that requirement.
Okay, so looking at like the new Point Hope development, they're mostly in the X development. This wouldn't apply to that area.
So the X and the shaded X are both outside that 100-year floodplain. So this version, our recommendation would not apply. I mean, certainly council can choose to go anywhere it would like to go with the regulation, but our recommendation would be that those areas would be outside of consideration at this point.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councilmember Waring.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Instead of talking floodplains, can we just talk elevations? So, for example, if somebody has a piece of property, Mr. Fountain, that, I don't know, it's got a 13 elevation on it, and it's new construction. Do they have to elevate the house to drive underneath, or can they do some sort of monolithic slab?
So it's going to depend a little bit on where it is, Mr. Chairman. If you were, if
Let's
you
say
were
it's West
very,
Ashland. Let's say it's West Ashland.
yeah, so if you are very close to the water, there are a few areas in the city that are up at like a A13 or a V13, where you would have to elevate and generally have a drive under situation. I think Councilman Gregg was talking about, there's certainly some areas like that in Daniel Island that were constructed in low-lying areas where they have to elevate very high. If you are, let's say, on one of the ridges in West Ashley and one of the ridges in Johns Island, and you're at a 13 or 14-foot elevation, so frequently those are outside of the tidal floodplain because you have to be very close to the water before the wave action or the tide forces basically bring the water in that high in your area.
Mm-hmm. See, one of the things when it comes to affordable housing, a lot of it's not going to be a 200-unit subdivision or 300-unit subdivision. A lot of it's going to be infill. And I can see this affecting that a pretty good bit. I mean, if you look at areas, you're familiar with East Oak and West Oak Forest, and I know the majority of those areas are built out, but hypothetically today, if that was vacant land, would it be habitable? If these new requirements were in place?
Sure. So, I mean, many of the homes in West Ashley, right, are built on crawl space foundation. That's a very common construction method in older West Ashley and the older homes in West Ashley. And that is absolutely a allowable method to meet your floodplain requirements under this, this set of proposed regulations, the way we're looking at it. So that's crawl space is completely allowed.
No, I maybe I'm not asking my question good enough. So again, we back to the scenario of if you go to East and West Oak Forest, I would think the topography over there is probably around 11-ish. Okay, and some of those houses are on slabs. There's not a lot of them on slabs over there. Today, if that was again, they were not already built upon. I think they're somewhat protected if they want to add on and all of that, because you remember, Mr. Mayor, we did the piece. Even if you wanted to go over 50%, in most cases, the assessed value is an obsolete number as far as valuation. So at least in our ordinance, we put the ability for a person to be able to get an appraisal based on market value. And of course, if they want to go with 50% of that, then yeah, they got to come up to current standard. But I am very intimidated by one thing: infill for affordable housing, and in other words, coming up with an ordinance that's really designed for huge subdivision. Whereas, and I know affordable housing is going to be more of that product is going to be infill. And if we come up with an ordinance that's designed for, again, let's say Councilmember Gregg's area where you just got, tract home builders after tract home builders, you're going to knock Gianna Show Johnson program and programs like that. Should the county come up with them, the cost would just be exponential. Affordable would be a name. It wouldn't be not in the monthly figure. So that's the part that I'm really kind of concerned about. When you talk about floodplains, 500 floodplains, a person that owns a piece of land out there, they really don't know that. Okay, they may know the topo, how high the piece of property is, because they get a survey. So that's the part that, and then I don't know. Do we have some legal online? How much of this will it fall into it being a taking? I mean, we're caught up in a lawsuit on that right now, on a pretty substantial lawsuit on that right now. Are we going to be running into more of these? People saying, "Well, listen, I can't afford it." Well, let me stop right there. Are we going to be mindful of whenever we come up with an ordinance of not taking people's property?
And I will just respond very briefly. We did spend quite a bit of time with Ms. Shaw Johnson, and she did indicate that the city no longer supports building slab on grade housing for affordable housing because they feel it's too high a chance of flooding and that puts residents in too vulnerable a situation based on, and John is actually on the I see her pop up, but John, certainly add in if I'm not paraphrasing your words correctly, but there have been so many issues basically with much of the housing authorities downtown slab on grade housing and the flooding that they've experienced, that they generally have been trying to steer away from slab on grade housing because of the impacts of flooding on residents. So in multifamily situations, it's a very different approach. Multifamily has the ability to do lots of things, floodproofing, other approaches. For individual homes, we're trying to stay away as a city, as an area, from those slab on grade homes because of the flood damage that we've seen to a lot of homes in the city.
Yeah, I understand, Chairman, Ms. Johnson, Chair Johnson. Allow me. I understand a lot of situations on the peninsula, but this ordinance, as I see, is going to apply to the entirety of Charleston. Am I wrong? Is it just going to apply to the peninsula?
No, you're correct. I was just saying that's where most of our slab on grade affordable housing is in the city, is on the peninsula, where we've seen a lot of the flooding issues. Certainly there is slab on grade housing in the outlying areas. And as one of the neighborhoods you mentioned, right, is Oak Forest, which you're 100% right. I think the city has now bought out 3 or 4 homes that are slab on grade homes in the last few years from the repetitive flooding that has basically caused such problems for those homeowners.
All right, Councilmember Gregg, back to you.
And Mayor, I think Councilmember Appel had his hand up.
Oh, I missed that. I'm sorry. Councilmember Appel.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this. This is really a commendable effort here, both by our staff, Dale and Matt and their respective teams, as well as the diverse array of stakeholders that have been brought to the table, not as a formality at the end, but at the beginning, to help shape and navigate this process. I mean, how many times have we seen a situation where the realtors, the home builders, the Coastal Conservation League, the historic groups are all together on a Zoom call with us, and nobody's screaming at each other? I mean, I'm just saying, this is something to not go unnoticed. This is a very positive thing. And I think it reflects an acknowledgement across this entire community that flooding is real, sea level rise is real. What we experience during rain bombs and high tide flooding events, it's not a political or ideological issue. It's a reality that we're all contending with. And I think that this is the product of all the great work the city has done over the years, the Dutch dialogues, et cetera. And so we're all coming to the table to try to find solutions that work. And we're hearing from all perspectives in all sides. And, so much of what we talk about around drainage has to do with new infrastructure projects, Spring Fishburne, Windermere Basin. We also talk a lot about maintenance of ditches and things of that nature. And those are all obviously extremely important. But another huge component of this long term is resiliency and putting ourselves in a position to not be so susceptible to a ditch being a little overflowed or poorly maintained. Because guys, let's face it, there's not enough billions of dollars in annual funding to create a situation where this area drains properly, if we're not careful about how we're building. And so we can't fix what's been built. We can't fix, the decisions that were necessarily made in the past, but we can stop the bleeding by prospectively developing in a much more sound manner. Ban, fill, and build is not a policy. It's a bumper sticker. If you just scream ban, fill, and build in a council meeting or on Facebook or wherever, that's not going to ever go anywhere, because that's not reality. Fill is sometimes a necessary component, but this policy before us gets as close as we can to the heart of what's behind that sentiment of banning, fill, and build. We are preventing unnecessary fill from being used to achieve sort of these height parameters that are problematic, and it's making us more resilient. And to Councilmember Waring's point, we always have to be mindful of the unintended consequences of our good intended regulations, and impacts to affordable housing and all of our communities is something that is equally important to us as we talk about these issues all the time. And one of the first questions I asked the working group was, what is the delta in terms of cost from building a crawl space type house versus a slab on grade? And I've been told that delta is not significant. And in fact, as these construction practices become more and more commonplace throughout this area, just as a matter of good practice, we're going to be seeing much more of this. The contractors and the folks that are involved in this industry are going to become much more familiar with the process, and it's not going to have that sort of negative impact that concern me as well on the front end. And also when you've got folks living in multi-million-dollar homes and they get a couple inches of water in their home, it's not good for anybody to have water in their home. But those are the folks best positioned to deal with it, right? But if you're somebody who's living in affordable housing in the city of Charleston and you're making 80% AMI or whatever the case may be, and you've got inches of water in your home, that's a whole different proposition. So I think it's all the more important that we have affordable housing built to be resilient and built to weather the storm, no pun intended, so we can make sure those that are not economically privileged have an opportunity to ride it out as well. So I think this is a good, reasonable start. It can show that the city of Charleston is not just in the business of putting together world-class plans. This is a way for us to continue to follow through on the innovation and the leadership that we've shown on our new stormwater manual by putting regulations into effect that will prevent the use of fill to build single family homes in places they don't belong. And so I think this is a good step forward. We need to make sure our stormwater review process works and there's communication between the city and engineers and developers, so we minimize the trips through TRC. That's a problem. We can't have that. We can have strict, tough stormwater regulations while being clear and transparent about what developers are going to be required to do, because we don't want this to exacerbate our housing affordability crisis. So sorry for going a little long, but I'm very happy about where we are on this, and I think that we're close to making another significant step in the fight against flooding.
Thank you, Council Member. Council members, do y'all mind if I slide a question in before I come back to Greg and Waring? Thank you. So I'm just curious, and this question might put our GIS information to task. And if it turned out to be a small number, it wouldn't bother me, because along the lines of what Councilmember Pell was just saying, I think the long term is, the direction we want to head in. But I'm just curious, since this is for new development, how many undeveloped sites are in that 100-year floodplain that this would actually apply to? Do we know that? Did anybody try to figure that out?
Mayor, this is a question that I had a while back, and asked planning to look into this, and of course they're very busy, so we'll get an answer on that soon. Okay. If I could take the liberty of the issue of cost of construction between slab on grade and a pier on beam or POW or whatever, stem wall foundation, there have been various studies done on this over the last 2 or 3 years. A lot of it was done post Hurricane Harvey, which, as you know, dumped a whole bunch of rain on Houston, 50 inches in 5 days. And there, like 50% of the flooding was outside the 500-year floodplain. So both the city of Houston and Harris County, which surrounds the city, they adopted very aggressive new regulation that would require pier on beam in their A and their V zones. And they also have a 3-foot BFE. So they were, pretty aggressive, and the city added a no net fill in the floodway. So they did a lot of things. And some studies indicate that the cost of construction between slabs and non-slab foundations, or the ones we're trying to get to, is about 1 to 3%. These numbers were a bit skewed because if you recall, 2019 and 2020 lumber prices were really high. There was a tariff war between the US and Canada, and lumber prices got pretty high there. Lumber prices have since come down. Cost of fill has gone up. So there are some variables that change on a regular basis, but 1 to 3% is the marginal cost increase generally between these types of foundations. And what you see in a more longer term scenario as the labor market adjusts, so as more carpenters and skilled craftsmen are called in to build pier on beam, and less cement trucks are called in and fill trucks are called in to do that, the labor market will adjust, and then the cost differential should decrease to near zero over time. So just that's the evidence you see around the US, certainly in the Southeast. Just wanted to comment on that. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Gregg, and then back to Waring.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, Dale. Actually, my question was going to be, what do we think the cost differential was? Your comments are very timely. I did just want to comment on one thing. I've heard Councilmember Rappel, maybe he misspoke, but he said this would prevent the construction of single family houses where they shouldn't be built. And we're not preventing any construction. All we're saying is you need to build these houses on pier and beam or some kind of crawl space foundation, 1 foot above the BFE. We're not preventing any construction in any of these places. So I just want to make sure we're all clear on that, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I meant to say was that we're preventing that technique of bringing in, but no, this is why this is not a takings, by the way.
Right.
Well, we've got that.
Yeah, that was the other follow-up. So
yeah, it's because we're fully allowing property to be developed. There's no uses that are being taken off the table. It's just we already have hundreds of code requirements that already apply to construction everywhere. This is just another code requirement.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think this makes a lot of sense. So thank you guys for putting this.
Just very, very briefly, Mr. Mayor, that the city does have a 2-foot freeboard requirement for new construction. 1 foot for substantial improvement, substantial damage, just as a clarity point.
Right.
Can you repeat that, Mr. Fountain?
Yes, yeah. So the city a couple of years ago did pass a 2-foot freeboard for new construction of either residential or commercial non-residential properties, a 2-foot of substantial improvement, substantial damage on non-residential properties, but only a 1 foot for substantial improvement, substantial damage on residential properties. So it is 2 feet of freeboard currently.
And that's only in the AE, right?
It's only in the 100-year floodplain. That's correct.
In the 100-year floodplain. Okay, thank you.
Right.
Yes.
Councilmember Waring.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I emphasized a lot on affordable housing, but then let me go again. I'm selfish looking at District 7, district I represent, which the mall is in that area, as well as we're sitting in the city right now, but we still have this thing going on with a 4-star hotel potentially being built, at DuPont and Savannah Highway. Now, if this were in place, Mr. Fountain, most hotels, they're not going to be built on up drive under. At least most of them, West Ashley's not going to be built that way. How would this affect a commercial development, like again, commercial hotel that has, a 500-room ballroom and that kind of stuff? And we've also already approved a bunch of apartments in and around the mall, what is now a parking lot. But we've already approved a PUD to put something like 1,100 units. units there. The mall potentially, it hadn't proven to be yet, but if they ever get the right capital going, an economic engine, West Ashley, it's not there yet. How would this affect that? And then the third thing, as far as stakeholders around the table, I applaud the stakeholders that's around this table. I think we need to have a stakeholder on the legal side, not with our department, but from the private sector side that represents property owners' rights. Now I know it says it's just another reg, but we have regs in place right now, and we caught up in those kind of lawsuits as we speak. So I think it would be good to have a maybe a property rights attorney that tend to represent private owner interests. If we can get that mindset around the table, working with some of the stakeholders that we have, then I think we may be able to craft a better order. But anyway, so to the commercial side, Mr. Fountain, and I would hope additional stakeholders. Now, Josh, I know you're in the room and you represent certainly realtors' interests, but I certainly would like to have somebody from the private sector, legal side, that's willing to come forth and say, this is good, but this could be a bear trap, before we write it into an ordinance. Mr. Fountain?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman, or Councilman Waring. So for a hotel property or any commercial property, this regulation does not apply. It only applies to single-family residential. Same thing for an apartment complex, which also gets basically termed as a commercial use under the way the city works. Same thing, the regulation does not apply. It's only applied to single-family attached or detached residential.
Thank you. I didn't realize it. Thank you. Now, what about the part about having somebody from the private sector side, Mr. Morris, on as being a stakeholder? Or do we have to put this out there and just take the risk of being sued?
Councilman, I think that's a good idea. We did have the Home Builders Association as part of this effort. Josh can speak for them. They were, again, part of the entire set of consultations from when Matt started them until we sort of concluded them this past summer. Happy to engage with Josh and others to see if we can bring that viewpoint in. Again, there's no ordinance in front of you, so there's nothing to change. We can try to seek their advice and see what they would recommend.
Thank you.
And Dale, just to add very briefly, we did also have Councilman, I do understand the sort of the different perspectives, and I think there is some value to a development attorney looking at it. We did certainly have the Southern Environmental Law Center involved as well, who certainly does have legal expertise in the field. So they did contribute, though I understand from a slightly different perspective, perhaps, than what can you build, but they certainly have that consideration as well in their expertise of what is likely to generate lawsuits.
Gotcha. All right, and we had the chamber with us all the way through. Bailey, thank you for your involvement and being a part of the team and your organization. So, all right, any other questions or comments? I would like to say that, or propose without objection, that we would ask our legal staff to work with Dale and Matt and the whole team here and try to put these concepts into words so we can bring back a ordinance that would be reviewed by Chris and Josh and Chamber and the parties first, and then bring it back to council afterwards. Does that sound like a plan?
Mr. Mayor, I agree with that, but I do think bringing that mindset in from a private sector legal side. With that exception, I agree with everything you said.
Absolutely. Josh and Bailey, I look to y'all to bring somebody along. Yep, got it. All right. Any other?
I'd just like to thank Mr. Mayor, everybody, and Dale and Matt, and you and everybody, Chris, Josh, for being able to come together. And Councilman Appel is spot on when he says to do all this up front is of immense help. Usually doing this at the 11th hour, and we're not too good at making that sausage on the floor of council. So I just want to thank having this workshop. I know it was one more thing we had to do, Dale, but I think the team you pulled together has certainly been beneficial. Thank you.
Agreed. Someone once said that too many chefs in the kitchen can ruin the stew, but this is a different kind of cooking. And it works here, works better when everybody's in the game up front. Julia, did you have something you wanted to add? I saw your face come forward a minute ago.
No, sir. I was just getting on here to say, yes, we will be happy to work with the team.
Great. Awesome. Terrific. All right. Anything else for the good of the order? If not, we thank you all for being with us and all the work and participating.
But Mr. Mayor, that's for the good of the order right there.
I was going to say earlier with the football analogy for our Carolina fans, they'll take every analogy. So this is, we've made it to the red zone. We're going to go ahead and work on this a little more and then get there for the final touchdown. Is that good enough?
All right.
Let's not throw an interception at the 1 yard line or fumble 2 kick returns. How about that?
Oh my gosh. Y'all are insufferable.
Otherwise, we'd beat them too bad to mention.
All right, everybody. Thank y'all.
Bye-bye.